But I do believe that by the mid-1930s there was something close to an intellectual war going on between them, and the story of that war has never really been told. One other point that I'd like to make about the 1920s and 30s is that a number of Americans discovered and proclaimed that we had been a nation of myth makers, as Constance Rourke put it. Charles Beard said the same thing. So did half a dozen other students of American culture, who argued that Americans were more disposed than most cultures, most societies, to mythologizing its past, to conflating history and legend and accepting myth as history. Now, this became a frequent refrain by the 1930s, particularly by the later 1930s, and you might expect that one result would be a concerted effort during the next generation to sort out the relationship between history and myth. Essentially, a truly serious effort at debunking, to use the phrase that's often associated with the 1920s, which is in many ways inappropriate because the people who were the debunkers constantly denied that their attitude towards American history was in any way irreverent. In any case, when just as Americans were discovering that we had been a nation of myth makers, along came the rise of fascism in Europe, the threat to Western civilization generally as it was perceived by these people, and the feeling, as Binet put it, that folklore and folk legends can be very important in sustaining the value system of a democratic society. Consequently, during the years of the Second World War, myths flourished, and after World War II, they flourished to an even greater degree, and the code word or buzzword that emerged was the word heritage, that now replaced the word memory, which had, and memorial and various memoir and various derivatives of it, that had been so much an important part of American discourse between 1870 and the 1930s. Now, heritage, in many, many different forms, I could give you literally hundreds of quotations and citations, heritage becomes the key word. The Freedom Train crisscrosses the United States in 1947, bringing American history to the American people. And what's crucial to recognize is that teaching American history became an important part of the Cold War effort to combat the threat of international communism. So that history taught with particular emphases and particular biases took on an important role in American society. The great collections that had been formed during the first 3 or 4 decades of the 20th century were now turned over to the public or open to the public. Williamsburg had opened in 1934 and really began to flourish immediately after World War II. Henry Francis DuPont, who formed the greatest collection, single collection in the United States of early American decorative arts and material culture, opened his private collection as a public museum in 1951. The Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village underwent a period of crisis at the time of Henry Ford's death in 1947, but then stabilized and its public programs began to develop. In every instance, the spokespeople for these organizations stressed that the single most important aspect of their mission was education. And they began explicitly to develop educational programs. In the case of Colonial Williamsburg, John D. Rockefeller III, who succeeded his father as the person in charge of operations there in the late 40s and early 50s, quite openly and quite candidly argued that Williamsburg ought to be used as a kind of forum for explaining to Americans as well as to people living in the free world generally what our heritage of freedom was all about. And John D. Rockefeller III sent several of his staff associates to Europe in 1951 to find out, to sort of test the waters, find out what was on the mind of those Europeans who were disposed to fight communism, and find out how Williamsburg could serve in this fight. So, for example, in 1952, a group of leaders in exile from Iron Curtain countries gathered in Colonial Williamsburg and in the very room where the House of Burgesses had met in the 18th century, they signed a Declaration of Freedom that was a kind of counterblast to Moscow and to the creation of the Iron Curtain mentality after World War II. I want to suggest that the phrase "an age of anxiety" emerged immediately after World War II. It's not entirely clear who coined it, though we believe W.H. Auden may have been the first in 1946 or 47. In any case, the phrase "an age of anxiety" was picked up and became a kind of buzzword of the late 40s and 50s. And the reasons why are not easy to pinpoint, but they can be related to the quest for security that resulted from the Cold War, from the feeling, particularly during the age of McCarthyism, that there was treason to be combated within the United States. And it also resulted from a phenomenon that Soren Kierkegaard has defined very well, that anxiety is the price one pays for freedom. That is to say, America emerged as the greatest power in the world, and with the highest standard of living that the world had ever known after 1945. Americans began to enjoy vacations for the first time, or 1 or 2 week vacations, which had been the norm, gave way to 3 and 4 week vacations for many people. Consequently, Americans literally were unsure of what to do with all the freedom that they had. There are various other reasons that one could go into to explain why this period, these 20 years after 1945, have been labeled an age of anxiety. But one result was that a wave of nostalgia began to sweep across the country, and it's that wave of nostalgia which is simply intensified during the last 10 years and which gave rise to this obsession with heritage, and which gave rise to myths not being explained or clarified or differentiations being made between myth and history, but instead myth and history being blurred together in the public mind. Let me point or call your attention to 3 anomalies that I find occurring during the generation since World War II that I think are significant turning points that we can reflect upon, thinking about what's happened with the emergence of a sense of tradition and memory in American culture. The first is that the government emerged after World War II for the first time as a major custodian of tradition. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that for a very long time, the government, state and federal, but particularly the federal government, had resisted playing a major role in, let's say, preservation activities or historical activities of any kind, such as purchasing the papers of famous Americans, or helping to save certain historic structures, or having a national archives. We did not have a national archives until 1934. By that time, European countries had had archives the Western European societies had archives for a very long time, and it was something of a scandal that we did not. But after World War II, the government emerged as a major custodian, and when John F. Kennedy became president, he gave a major lift to this because he and his wife took a great interest in the American heritage broadly conceived, from the decorative arts to sustaining the role, sustaining the role of writers and cherishing what previous architects and writers and painters and so on had achieved. Nevertheless, despite the fact that the government began to play a major role for the first time in our history after the war, I would submit that the most successful activities having to do with the national history actually were very decentralized and took place in the states and even more in the localities. For example, if you look at what little has been written about the Civil War centennial that was celebrated between 1961 and 1965, it's clear that as a national event, it was very unsuccessful. And I have an interesting letter from Congressman Fred Schwengel of Iowa, written to Alan Nevins, who was the chairman of the Civil War Centennial Commission, saying that as a national event, the Civil War centennial was a failure, but that in the localities, in communities, it was doing quite well. That's where interest was generated. But there was no national focal point. Similarly, I would suggest that during the bicentennial of the American Revolution, once again, there was no focal point. And that as a national event, it was not particularly successful, but within individual communities, it was indeed. Excuse me. And we now have 5 massive volumes printed at the taxpayer's expense by the government printing office, indicating just how successful the bicentennial of the American Revolution was within American communities. So we have the federal government emerging as a major custodian and putting a lot of money into the national memory, if I may speak metaphorically, and nevertheless, the most successful activities occurring on a decentralized basis. The second point, the second anomaly that I'd like to call your attention to, has to do with the ongoing process of the democratization of tradition. For example, criticisms began to be raised in the 1960s that the kinds of historic sites one could visit essentially reflected the lifestyle and the history of elite Americans, successful Americans. Where could one go in order to see how ordinary Americans had lived? What life had been like for them in this country. During the 1970s, more than 50 living farms have emerged across the United States, such as the Turkey Run Farm near Mount Vernon, which is designed to show how a very ordinary dirt farmer would have lived on the eve of the American Revolution. There are various other examples I could point to, and I would simply suggest that this effort to democratize tradition, which began with those seeking a folk culture in the 20s and 30s, has continued. But at the same time, the cost or the market value of American antiques has skyrocketed, so that some pieces now sell for $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, or $100,000. They are regarded as a blue chip investment in a time when the stock market is in pretty bad shape. Moreover, it's a time when tradition-oriented institutions and projects, such as libraries and historical societies and scholarly editing projects, are impoverished and whose future existence is in very precarious shape because of an unwillingness by various potential sources of funding to continue to support them. A third and related anomaly that I'd like to call your attention to is that, on the one hand, there has been a democratization of interest in history in the years since World War II. There's been what we call the roots phenomenon, an interest in family history, local history, regional history, ethnic history. The National Archives and various other places have never been so full of people tracing their genealogies. At the same time, tests administered to large numbers of people, for example, tests administered periodically by the New York Times since 1943, indicate that the knowledge that the American people have, the substantive knowledge that they have of their history, is woeful. That some American children at the junior high school level don't know which came first, the American Revolution or the Civil War. A former student of mine teaching in a liberal arts college devoted a week in the U.S. History Survey course to World War II, one lecture on what was happening overseas, foreign policy and the military side, and the second lecture on the home front, the domestic sphere, and then the third session of the course was for discussion. After the first lecture, a little group of students came up to my former student and said, "Wait a minute, Professor Altshuler, are you telling us that in this war you're talking about," and so far as they're concerned, World War II could have been the Third Crusade. It occurred before they were born and was no more immediate to them than something that happened in the 13th century. They said, "Wait a minute, Professor Altshuler, you mean to tell us that in this war that you're talking about, the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese were on the same side?" Well, in this day and age, professors have to be very careful about being patronizing to students because students fill out course evaluation forms and things like that. So Glenn was very careful, and he simply nodded benignly and said, "Yes, that's right. The Germans and the Italians and the Japanese were on the same side." And then one of the students said, "Who won?" Well, they hadn't gotten to that yet in the textbook, and the student had no knowledge of it from high school. So I'm simply trying to illustrate that American history is not particularly well taught in the secondary schools. It's been absorbed into a rather gooey, spongy thing called social studies. And many of our history majors at Cornell University tell me that they become history majors by accident. That is to say, when they leave high school, they say that they vow never again to take another history course. It's so boring. but they happen to stumble into one, or they hear that one is good and have a good experience with it, and then take another and eventually rediscover history. But my point is simply that this growing popular interest in history has not resulted in Americans knowing their history any better than they did a generation or two or three ago. I would suggest, by way of conclusion, that history today, 1982, is fashionable in the United States, but it's perceived as being for the individual without any commercial or vocational value. It may have commercial value to antique dealers or people who run museums that, or villages that have high admission fees. But history is fashionable to know and to be interested in, but it's not something to be pursued as a career. Ellen Glasgow made a very interesting, but at this point rather neglected novelist who wrote a great many historical novels, observed in perhaps the best of her novels, called The Sheltered Life, which was published in 1932, observed that people who have tradition are oppressed by tradition, and people who are without it are oppressed by the lack of it, or by whatever else they have put in its place. Well, I would suggest that that's a very apt description of much that I've been trying to suggest to you, that excuse me, modernism in architecture, in literature, in various art forms, painting, could spring up and flourish in Europe during the 20th century precisely because so many of the cultures there felt oppressed by tradition. In the United States, in a certain sense, we've proceeded in the opposite direction because many Americans have gradually come to feel oppressed by the lack of it. And so they've begun to try to put various things in its place, as Ellen Glasgow said. Well, I think that's fine, so long as we're reasonably clear in our understanding of what we are putting in its place, so long as we don't simply substitute myths, new myths for old myths, so long as we get a fairly clear sense of history, and most of all, so long as we have a clear sense as laymen, not as professional historians or professional scholars, but as laymen, of what we're going to do with it, and what it's going to mean to us. I'll close with an anecdote about an event which occurred 25 years ago when I was a senior in college. I was sitting at a luncheon table in a student union, very much like this one day. I had a table for four. There were three of us at the table, two fellows and a girl, and then a second girl came along and sat down, and she didn't know the first girl who was already at the table, and so I introduced them, and they made small talk, and one asked the other, what are you majoring in? And the first one said, well, I'm majoring in history. And the other one said, oh my God, what are you going to do with it? And the first one said, I'm going to live with it, which is an answer that has given me a kind of sustenance ever since, because most people don't grow up to become professors of history. It never was a very good idea, and in this day and age, it's particularly not a good idea. And therefore, the value of studying history has everything in the world to do with living with it, meaning that it can affect the way you perceive your country, it can affect the way you perceive your country's present and future prospects, can affect the way you perceive the differences and the similarities between your own country and other countries when you travel abroad, or when you try to understand how and why certain foreign policy decisions were made and not made. There are various other reasons and rationales that I could supply, but I think that they are probably very familiar to you at this point. I certainly don't want to preempt the role of my colleagues who teach history here, and at this point, most of Professor Craven's students probably have writer's cramp from taking notes in any case. So I'll stop and simply leave you with the thought that the reason for studying history is to live with it for the rest of your life, because it is in my view, a very cherished legacy and something that can make one's life more enjoyable and one's understanding of American culture more interesting. Thank you.